Hey, it's Dr. Mitch here. I want to go ahead and continue on some of the social consequences purportedly linked to cannabis. I'm going to go ahead and do the driving section. Eager to get into this. It's very important. I usually joke around in these cannabis lectures. This is not a topic that's a jocular one. I just want to emphasize the take home message right off the bat is never drive impaired. We're at an era now where you could literally get your phone and get somebody to you relatively easily for relatively cheap. And there's really no need to ever drive impaired. Let's take a look at some of the deaths per billion vehicle miles traveled, right? So a billion is a huge number. You haven't lived a billion seconds until you're almost 31 years old, right? So these are big numbers, but we've got, 300 million people living in the US. We want to keep that in mind. And this is pretty overwhelming at first, but the interesting line here is this orange one, deaths per million people. And then the red one, deaths per billion vehicle miles traveled. And as you can see, we're on a general downward trend here since, say, the 1960s. In the 1970s, during the energy crisis, what a surprise, we sort of had a decrease in the deaths related to vehicle miles traveled. It's also, associated with fewer miles traveled. During the coronavirus right now, nobody seems to be leaving their houses, which is a good thing. And the number of deaths per million people, I'm optimistic, is going to drop. Truth be told, if you can do something electronically without having to drive somewhere, it's probably the best thing for our environment, etc. We're doing something right. I'm eager to emphasize that alcohol induced impairments for driving are very real. Alcohol is an incredibly dangerous drug, particularly when it comes to driving. And blood alcohol concentrations are highly varied for when folks show impairment. Different people have different levels of tolerance. Our current strategy of using a BAC of 0.10 or 0.08 now is incredibly generous. If you've ever been at 0.08, you'll know that can be me walking drunk unless you're a pretty experienced consumer of alcohol. Cannabis, same deal. So there are some folks who, at quite a few nanograms per milliliter blood THC, can still drive just fine. I'm going to talk about some of the behavioral measures of impairment rather than these blood or urine based ones, and essentially emphasize that getting somebody's blood is illegal search and seizure. That's just weird. We shouldn't have to do that in order to prosecute someone for violating a crime, and what's in your blood shouldn't be a crime. Messing up, driving when you shouldn't be driving, that's a crime and a very serious one. And we'll talk about how to draw the distinction between those two. Well, so here's an intriguing slide that's showing an important measure of driving impairment, and that's the standard deviation of lateral position. What's that really mean? It means how much do you weave back and forth within a lane, right? If your lateral position stays right down the center, your standard deviation of lateral position will be 0. If it starts to move back and forth, then obviously the standard deviation of the lateral position is going to get bigger. So here's a comparison of two groups, a drug group and a placebo group, and you can see here the drug group has a markedly larger standard deviation of lateral position, and it's statistically significant. That alone, is that enough to say, hey, we should make this drug illegal? I want to just kind of get your thoughts about that, get a feel for, would this be enough to say this drug should be illegal simply because it makes driving more impaired? Feel free to sound off in the comments section. And now let's take a look. Oh wait, I accidentally gave you the Benadryl, right? The antihistamine data. And in fact, yes, after 50 milligrams of Benadryl, of diphenhydramine, you should not drive, right? It's insane. It really would be very difficult. And, some folks are more tolerant than others, and it depends on your body size. But this is a terrible idea. But should we make Benadryl illegal? No, no, that's not a rationale at all. We can trust adults to behave in competent ways, and if they don't, punishment should be swift and highly likely, right? The idea is making sure that folks are competent, not making molecules in the bloodstream illegal. Let's take a look at some of the older data on this. What's curious is when my book first came out, the biggest reviews on cannabis-related links to driving accidents actually suggested that cannabis users were slightly less likely to cause accidents. It was always just, a little 0.2, they were 20% less likely in most things across these 3 studies, and no one would believe it, of course. But we need to think about the mechanism, and in fact, we have data in support of the idea that folks who have used cannabis seem to be less likely to try to pass other cars, they do not speed, and they increase their stopping distance, meaning when they see a stop sign, they start to stop pretty much right away. And that seems to be what's going on, but we're essentially trusting folks to compensate on their own, and that's not a position we really want to put ourselves in. So let's talk about what the recommendations are. If you'll take a look at just side effect warnings on medications, there are some for Marinol, the synthetic THC suspended in sesame oil. That's clearly a situation where you essentially had an edible, and folks need to have time to adjust to that before they drive. But folks can drive on that. It's completely legal. The opiate drugs, we're seeing some tough times for opiate addiction, and by day 5, most folks on Vicodin or things like that are not impaired, and the motor effects really do dissipate, and they still have those analgesic effects. The poor constipation is still there, right? And then the antihistamines, as I was alluding to. So Benadryl, first of all, you should only take 25 milligrams, but truth be told, people do adjust to that. If we're going to cut slack to folks for that, could we cut comparable slack to medical cannabis users? Why not? All right. Well, these data are old now. So Roby in the Netherlands had data from 1998 suggesting that folks do make some modest changes in their driving ability at doses that weren't measured, but after about a 10 milligram THC dose, that increase in the lateral movement, so that not being able to stay right down the center of the lane was the key issue, but there was no change in handling, turning, or maneuvering. Now let's think about the reactivity of these measures. So this was done with someone asked to drive in Maastricht in the streets, right, which is highly externally valid and good generalizability, but you've got the driving instructor right there rating the handling and turning and maneuvering, right? So how reactive is that? Do you drive as carefully with no one in the car as you would with this driving instructor who you know is rating you? And that's the key issue. And this is why I'm going to emphasize, don't drive high, but drive as if you were. How do they do it? How do cannabis intoxicated people keep their driving reasonable? They decrease their speed. They're markedly less likely to try to pass another car. They increase their stopping distance, as I mentioned, and they increase the space between their car and the car in front of them. So that headroom, as they call it, that lead between their car and the next car, is always large. And this is an incredibly good habit, high or not, okay? This is how you should drive. No need to go to the speed limit all the time. Definitely don't need to pass other cars. Make sure your stopping distance is more than adequate, right? Give yourself plenty of time to stop and leave a lot of room between your car and the car in front of you. Now, in Los Angeles, when I drive like that, somebody would always get in there, but hey, then I would just slow down even more. And the bottom line is this is how you don't have accidents. And then I want to emphasize throughout this, if you add alcohol, you die. All right. Cannabis and alcohol do not mix for a whole huge number of reasons we've discussed in the past, but it's particularly impairing with driving. You don't need a dose of alcohol or a dose of THC that is anywhere near something impairing by itself. The synergy between these two is remarkable. As we've mentioned in the past, alcohol slows metabolism of a number of drugs, including THC. I'm not trying to lower anybody's cannabis bill, but I'm just saying if you have alcohol in your system, the metabolism of THC is going to slow down. And so the time of impairment is going to be markedly longer, but we don't seem to know how to compensate. So here, alcohol is a drug that often makes you not start stopping until too late. And then the cannabis may actually be a reaction to folks learning how to handle that from alcohol. It's super confusing and just a terrible idea. And your own rating of impairment, you can trust from the sense that if you know you shouldn't drive, you definitely shouldn't drive. But we tend to overestimate our own abilities on everything, including driving under these circumstances. Call an Uber, man. Well, with that in mind, what do the data look like if you look across a whole bunch of studies? We've talked about meta-analysis before. It's an analysis of all the other analyses. We definitely see simulators end up leading to larger estimates of cannabis-induced impairment than actual on-the-road studies, but there aren't a ton of either kind. I think in part the simulator just, if you've got THC in your system, you don't take it quite as seriously. There's something reactive about that. What really does happen if we've got cannabis and fatal injury, we've got a 1.26, so 26% more likely to essentially have a fatal injury related accident. That is huge because our measure here is death, right? The dependent variable is literally somebody dying. We want to, take any effect size really seriously. This got to reach statistically significant. In contrast, the cannabis and any traffic accident is not significant. It's 1.1. Even a fender bender counts in those. Paul Armentano, who I want to thank for these data, uses an asterisk to say not statistically significant. In fact, that's not the usual standard. But the bottom line is, even though these effects are small, traffic accidents are a hassle, and a fatal injury is such a serious issue that we never want to have folks driving high. In contrast, we do have some data from other drugs that can provide reasonable comparisons. So analgesics, particularly over-the-counter analgesics, what we see is if 1.0 is how folks who have nothing in their system drive, they're at 1.02 for accidents. Okay, that is just not an issue. The antihistamines, despite me ranting about Benadryl there, most folks take antihistamines at a markedly lower dose and don't drive until they're habituated to them. So data suggests 1.12, penicillin 1.12. I think that's just a confound because if you're on penicillin, you're usually sick. And the anti-asthma drugs are actually 1.31. This is starting to scare me. That's actually bigger than the cannabis-related estimate. And so if you are on an asthma drug, just make sure you're accustomed to it. And if you change your medication, by all means, make sure you're not cognitively impaired when you get behind the wheel. And then all these drugs have what I think are meaningfully larger effect sizes when it comes to predicting just accident rates. So amphetamines, despite their reputation for making folks more attentive and alert, actually have 6 times the rate of accidents. I'm afraid it's that haunting effect of more stimulation making folks higher in risk taking. I'm going to make the same thing assertion for cocaine here, which is almost 3 times the rate. And cocaine-induced narcissism and the assumption that everything's going to be fine is really an issue. So the stronger opiates, the illicit opiates, 1.91 here. Z drugs are just some anxiolytics that have a different mechanism than our usual benzodiazepines, 2.6, and the benzos 2.3, especially early on in the benzo treatment for anxiety in particular. You see an exaggerated rate of all kinds of motor impairment, and the subjective effects are more dramatic. Again, if you do have anxiety, email me and I'll send you a self-help book and talk about some alternative ways to go. I'm not, I don't think the benzos should be illegal or anything. I just think there's a way to not have to take the doses that a lot of folks are on. And truth be told, being a little anxious is just part of life. All right, well, if we actually look at cannabis users and risk for a single accident, so literally just having cannabis by itself, the rates often are exactly the same as the rates for regular drivers. It's when another drug is in combination, which is really dreadful, or even compared to other illicit drugs, cannabis in combination will create a higher crash risk, or any of those hard drugs by themselves are usually a really rough time. With that in mind, then, I want to say there is a weak positive association between cannabis use and culpability, but this is cannabis in the system, right? So positive THC test in the blood, right? Not urine screen, not something that's going to measure cannabis use from weeks before, and that is a relatively small effect, and one that I wanted to just stress. We do have a potential confound in that cannabis users are often higher on some of the personality traits that also co-vary with accident risk, so we want to keep that in mind. These folks weren't randomly assigned. And the rant I'm going to have about urine screens is that really a urine screen does not measure current state of intoxication. A blood test is a hassle, but at least it's going to give you a number of nanograms per milliliter of blood that THC is. The variation in human tolerance to THC is so vast that I feel like this is a ridiculous way to measure it. And although the data on roadside sobriety tests are far from perfect, at least there's a measure of some kind of psychomotor function, right? Now, I know that there are a lot of law enforcement training programs that claim that they can, not only tell if you're intoxicated, but tell which drug you're on, and I assure you that is complete nonsense. Nevertheless, if you can't do some of the key tasks in the roadside sobriety tests, then odds are high you should not be driving. Let me get into that just for a second, but the hallmark ones, at least for THC, are that heel to toe walk in a straight line, but they don't make the same errors that folks who consume alcohol make. So generally folks who consume alcohol, they can't seem to stay balanced without putting their arms out. In contrast, the law enforcement officer will say, first of all, take 11 steps, don't start until I say so. Cannabis users, or if you've recently used cannabis, you're likely to just go ahead and start. And the counting to 11, I mean, it's just embarrassing. They don't remember, or they just keep walking. It just doesn't seem to go very well. And then the elevated foot stand for 30 seconds, which is actually a very difficult task and a very sensitive one. So you have your left foot out in front of you, about about 18 inches off the ground, and hold that for 30 seconds. Obviously, that's a tough one, right? But if you can't do that, you definitely should not be driving, right? And so sort of keep those in mind. Now, I know intoxicated practice makes anything better. I'm not saying go practice these when you're high. I'm just saying don't drive when you're high. All right. So this odds ratio 1.0 for drivers with THC concentrations greater than 5 nanograms per milliliter was actually lower than drivers with blood concentrations less than 2 nanograms per milliliter. I think what has happened here is they just happened to sample the highly tolerant positive drivers. And so, if you're a regular user because you're got a medical condition or something, 5 nanograms per milliliter is actually likely your regular state when you first wake up in the morning. So your tolerance is going to be more. This is why I'm much more a fan of behavioral measures of impairment. So, yeah, the cannabis and fatal injury stuff, that odds ratio of 1.83, including the one that's the lowest estimate identified. So we are seeing almost a doubling here with cannabis tested positive at the time. Positive THC driver and injury risk was only 1.0, right? I can't account for this. Essentially, the idea is you're more likely to have a fatal injury, but no more likely to have an injury to the driver. Right? That kind of scares me. That means you're more likely to actually hurt somebody else than yourself. Again, I want to just emphasize that's not a good idea. All right, I'm going to move to side 2 just so I can make sure this is going to fit on PowerPoint. I really appreciate you tuning in. I'll see you on Cannabis and Driving Part 2.